I know I keep saying it, but I really love autumn. So the question is a scooter as good as a motorcycle for long distance touring? So of course a scooter is just as good as a motorcycle for long distance touring in many respects, and in a couple it is even better. What I'm going to do in this video is just go through why I think a scooter is as good as a motorcycle for touring, where it's equivalent to a motorcycle, and perhaps some of the points that you might not have thought about in terms of where a scooter is actually better than a motorcycle for touring. Anyway, let's crack on. And before you ask, I have got lots of experience in terms of riding much bigger bikes over to Europe, so 1200 GS, 1150 GS Adventure, big old Triumph 1200, variety of other road bikes and stuff. So, you know, I do have some experience of that. But what I want to do in this video is, it's not about persuading people to swap their bikes for scooters, you know, because I totally get the difference between want and need and the love of power and speed and all that kind of good stuff. No, this is about whether, you know, if you're the kind of person that's got a scooter, or you're thinking about getting a scooter and you think it's got a narrow set of capabilities, but you might still want to go to Europe, but you're not quite sure. So this video is really for you, and I'll just run through some of the areas where I found a scooter such as the ADV 350 to be utterly fabulous for long distance touring. And to be honest with you, it's not just about the ADV, it's about any of these mid-size scooters, because I really do believe they hit the sweet spot of scooterdom. You know, they're still light, they're still manoeuvrable, but they've got enough power. Anyway, we're going to run through a number of factors which will hopefully answer the question as to whether a scooter is as good as a motorcycle when it comes to touring. So, as you can probably tell, I'm back in the UK, but it is autumn. That's my favourite time of the year. Right, let's talk about some facts and figures then about my recent trip to Greece on the ADV 350. So I have a piece of paper that I've specially prepared. So let's talk about mileage, or kilometres. So on the trip meter, trip B was recording my total trip mileage. So that was 2,717 miles, or in metric terms, 4,372 kilometres. And again, according to the trip meter, I got 83.5 miles to the gallon, which works out at 3.38 litres for every 100 kilometres. So in total then, just using the average UK petrol price for a gallon, that means I used about 32.5 gallons, or 147.5 litres. So using the average UK price, that means I spent under 200 quid on petrol for a trip that was just over 2,700 miles, which I think is pretty good. So if you think about it, 83.5 miles per gallon. You know, a big adventure bike, big tourer bike is probably going to do half of that, you know, so you'd be spending nigh on 400 quid, you know, for a bigger bike. What does a scooter do as well as a motorcycle? So according to my comprehensive notes, comfort, practicality, the capability envelope. And what do I mean by the capability envelope? Well, I think, you know, for most folk that tour on big motorcycles, you know, unless you're like Paul Tarez and you're actually, you know, you're doing the TET or something like that, I think from a capability envelope perspective, a scooter can do all of the roads and the types of riding that you would probably do on a larger motorcycle. So motorways, A roads, B roads, you know, and some of the smaller back roads as well. So that's what I mean about the capability environment. And I think also a scooter covers the ground as well as a large bike and as quickly as a large bike. Yes, the scooter isn't as fast, but what I mean by covering the ground is, you know, how many miles, how many kilometres can you do in a 5-hour ride? And if you think about it in terms of, you know, touring, where the best roads are the roads where you can't go faster than 70 miles an hour, then the scooter will cover the ground on those types of roads just as quickly as a motorbike. So in 5 hours, I would expect to cover around 280 to 300 miles on a scooter. and I would do exactly the same on a bigger, much more powerful motorbike. Now, I know this because when I travel up and down to Manchester quite a lot to see the relatives from Berwick upon Tweed, and it's around 420 miles round trip, you know, and it probably takes me about 8 hours for both legs. And I've done that trip on the scooter many times. I've done it on much bigger motorbikes, 1200 GS, my Z900, 1200 Trophy, lots of different motorbikes, and it always takes me the same amount of time. And I would much prefer to be on this when I hit the M60. Now, where do I think the scooter is much better than a motorcycle? Okay, these might be a couple of things that you might not have thought about before. So the first one is heating. So when you're riding in a very, very hot environment, obviously on a motorcycle, you've got the engine in front of you and you've got the fan. And the heat of the engine and the motorcycle really adds to the ambient temperature. So when I was in Italy and Greece, you know, the air temperature was probably about 31, 32 degrees, but the tarmac, I don't know, 40 degrees, 42 degrees. But the scooter didn't add to the temperature that was affecting me, or the environmental temperature at all. And it was a massive bonus, you know, because of course the engine is down at the rear, the radiator is at the front but really low down. So you don't feel any extra additional heat, just the environmental heat. And it was a massive, massive bonus, I can tell you. And then the other thing is, and I don't think I've ever mentioned this in any of my reviews of the ADV 350, is the vibration, or rather the absolute and complete lack of vibration. So I found on this, I just don't get white finger. I suffer from vibration induced white finger quite a lot, and I've always had it on pretty much every motorbike I've ever owned. But on the scooter, I've just never ever had it. And that is throughout the rev range. You know, it really is quite incredible. So from low revs to high revs to touring and cruising at an indicated 80 miles an hour, no vibration whatsoever. And the secondary benefit of that is the mirrors stay crystal clear all the time. And I've never had that on any of my motorbikes. So I think those are the two main reasons as to why it's better. We've already talked about why I think it's as good as a bigger motorcycle. So the comfort, the practicality, the capability envelope, covering the ground. And, you know, the luggage as well. The luggage and the packing is fabulous. And because I've been asked a few more questions about the luggage and what I took with me, here's just a little piece in more detail about the luggage and the packing situation and why it's so good. Okay, so let's go through the luggage and the packing first. So basically everything that I needed for 16 nights away was contained within the setup that you see here. So either under the seat or in the top box. So let's go through what went where and what I took with me in more detail now. So first off, let's talk about under the seat. So I'll just pop the seat open for a second. Okay, so as I've said many times before, you've got 48 litres of space underneath here. So what I used this for was in this part of the compartment, so this part here, I put all my heavy stuff. So I took a 2-metre lock and chain with me, I took a shackle lock with me, a foot pump, first aid kit, puncture repair kit, 3 pairs of gloves, my waterproof over trousers, a bag of emergency nuts and almonds and other bits and pieces for me to nibble on, and all of that went under there. And the benefit of putting it under there is that all that heavy stuff is as low down as it can possibly get. And I must say that when fully loaded up, I didn't notice any difference at all with the handling. It was brilliant, and in fact it might have made the handling even better. It certainly made the suspension work better, I think. A lot more compliant, and it was a really good ride. So that's that part of the seat. Now in this part of the seat, I kept my camera equipment. So, you know, if you don't carry a load of camera equipment, you're going to have tons of space. That's the bag that I carry all my camera stuff in. So that just fits in quite nicely there. And in addition to that, I've also got my tripod, which I'll show you later. And what I found with this setup was that there was still enough room that when I needed to take my leathers off, you know, when it got too hot, I could still put my leathers underneath the seat and close the seat easily, which was a great bonus. Now you may notice as well that in some of the videos I did have a bag, a rucksack bungeed to the side here. That was really just an emergency bag, just in case I felt I needed, you know, a little bit of extra space for some reason, but I never used it. Okay, so next up is a top box. Let me get the right keys. So this is the 47 litre Givy Blade top box. Not much inside it at the moment, but just to give you a clue as to what I included in here, it was my clothes. Nice pair of orange pants and a nice pair of green pants. Look at that, lovely. So I did take more than that. So basically all my clothes for 16 days I put in there. That included, you know, a pair of jeans for walking around in, a pair of walking shoes, obviously pants and socks and stuff, a couple of clean shirts and t-shirts, etc. A walking jacket also went in there. And I also, that's where I stored my riding jeans. So my textile riding jeans, so these things that I've got on at the moment. And all of that fitted in there perfectly. And I've got a bag, which I borrowed off the wife. I've got a soft bag where I put everything in and then just put it into there. So in terms of kind of practicality and ease of use, I mean, I'd come down to the ferry hold, I'd have everything in my bag, slot it into the bag, 30 seconds later, I'm ready to go. And I must admit, I wasn't at all jealous of the folks that have, you know, all these little tiny roll top bags all over the place. It took them ages to get ready. And this setup as well means that, you know, everything is secure. There's nothing that anybody can get at unless obviously they steal the whole scooter. So for me, it was not only was it useful in terms of it had all the capacity that I needed, it didn't affect the handling at all. It's completely secure and held within the bag. And it was so easy to use. You know, no faffing about with bungees, no faffing about with horrible annoying clips and millions of horrible and annoying sort of roll top bags and stuff. It was brilliant. And of course, by definition, totally waterproof. And if you wanted more luggage capability in your Solo, obviously you've got the back of the seat that you could use. And I think you could probably get some panniers on here as well, you know, some soft panniers. But yeah, this was brilliant. It worked perfectly for me. You know, there was nothing that I had to miss out. Everything was waterproof, everything was safe, and it was so easy and quick to use. So, where is a scooter not as good as a motorcycle for long distance touring? Well, the obvious one is obviously speed, power, acceleration, which then arguably would suggest that a scooter isn't as exciting as a motorcycle, and I would have to agree, you know, it's not as involving as riding a motorcycle, and particularly if you want to exercise your motorcycle while you're away, and that's one of the reasons for the trip, then of course you won't get that with the scooter. And I guess the other aspect is kind of associated to that, and that's its two-up ability. Now of course you can ride two-up on a scooter. I could have ridden two-up on my ADV 350, but certainly I would have felt the difference that a pillion passenger would make. And of course, when you're on a super powerful bike these days, you know, you just really don't notice the pillion passenger. So those would be the two main ones for me: speed, power, acceleration, the excitement, and the ability therefore to carry a passenger. So a couple of other places where I think a scooter is better than a motorcycle for long distance touring, and these might be the obvious ones. So certainly the economy. So over 2,700 miles on my trip to Greece, I averaged 83.5 miles to the gallon, which I think is pretty incredible. And as I mentioned before, it covers the ground just as quickly as any motorcycle I've ever ridden. And then I think there's the ease of use. Now, we've talked about the packing and the luggage and stuff, but what I mean by the ease of use is kind of the riding ease of use. You know, for narrow roads, having to do U-turns, parking, getting on and off the scooter, etc. It's all very, very easy. And while I was away, you know, I did notice, you know, a couple of people struggling with their much heavier bikes, you know, turning them around or getting caught in crosswinds and things. And yes, you can deal with that, but when you don't have to deal with it, and you've got something where ease of use is just kind of implicit in the whole motorcycle, it really is a nice bonus to have. And I think more importantly, or most importantly, the attribute that I really enjoyed about this trip, and particularly going on the scooter, is almost kind of like an emotional one. And it's difficult to put into words, but it's what I felt was really relaxing and really refreshing was not having the emotional concern about having a £20,000 very expensive bike with me, either from a riding perspective or from a leaving it outside a hotel perspective. You know, I had no fear of dropping it, and even if I did drop the scooter, I knew I'd be able to pick it up. I wasn't really that worried about leaving it anywhere. Obviously, I did all the usual security stuff. But there is something about, you know, when you've invested a lot of money in a machine and you're taking it for a long trip to countries that are outside of your own, you know, you do have a bit of an emotional concern, and you are very aware of the risk of theft and accident, etc., when you've got a motorcycle that's worth that much money. Now, I've done that many times before, so I do know the feeling, and I'm not knocking people for feeling that. But I'll tell you what, it's really nice not to have that kind of sense of emotional concern for a motorcycle that costs an awful lot of money and is also very, very large. It's a really good bonus. If you were at the time of life, you know, from an age perspective or a situation perspective, you know, where the bigger bikes are just not suitable for you anymore, but you still want to expand your horizons in terms of where you go riding and, you know, and visiting other countries, then I'd seriously consider a scooter. Don't think they're only commuter bikes. Forget about what they look like. They can really expand your horizons. And I would also say, finally, that not everything on two wheels has to be an adventure, despite what you see on YouTube. You know, going away on holiday doesn't have to involve a drama, a crisis, an accident, an injury, or something terrible happening. You can go away on two wheels and have a fabulous time with none of that. And for me personally, I think the scooter really helped with changing the type of holiday and the type of trip that I've just had over in Greece. And it was brilliant. It was different, but it was brilliant. So I'll leave you with that thought. Not everything needs to be an adventure. Oh, I love autumn.